1:42 a.m., early morning of the 26th of December, 2025. The air defense duty shift in the coastal Azov sector of Krasnodar Krai is at the quietest phase of the night. On the integrated display, the S-300 and S-400 radar grid blankets the port of Temryuk and the surrounding harbor area. Scan rings are even rhythm steady and no priority signals appear. This duty station is controlling a coastal rear area cluster where no blind spots are permitted to exist. A few faint low traces appear at the edge of coverage. They are logged classified and then continue drifting across the screen like targets that do not require the system to change posture. The most dangerous thing at that moment is not in the sky ahead of them, but in the confidence that the current operating rhythm can be maintained a little longer. The air defense corridor of the coastal Azov sector in Krasnodar Krai is established as a continuous operational shield. Over the port of Temryuk and the surrounding harbor area, S-300 PM2 and S-400 Triumph systems are deployed in overlapping layers, creating a dense and stable coverage zone. At the center of the network are 1 to 2 target designation nodes where all target tracks from surveillance radars are concentrated, assigned priority, and then distributed to launchers. The reaction tempo of the entire sector is tightened around these points. For months, low-flying, slow-speed targets have appeared sporadically and either been quickly handled by the short-range layer or tracked until they exited the danger zone. Not once had the S-400 been forced to sustain a prolonged high load, forming an implicit assumption low-assessed signals are not capable of disrupting the system's operating rhythm. Processing limits are not visible on the screen. Each radar carries only a finite number of tracking channels. Each non-priority track still consumes a channel time and the attention of the duty crew. As the numbers increase, the network does not collapse immediately, but slows by a fraction each cycle, narrowing the reaction window while the overall status still displays normal. The faint traces are no longer isolated phenomena. They spread along the Azov coastline. On the integrated display, dozens of modified civilian UAVs appear at low altitude under 200 meters slow speed, divided into multiple small clusters. None rushes forward. None is sufficiently priority. But the S-300 PM2 and S-400 Triumph are forced to track them all. Radar continues to acquire the targets, and that is precisely the trap. Each trace forces the system to hold the OK longer. Track files drop and reacquire. Signatures fluctuate with the coastal terrain. Lost track warnings appear sporadically. Processing rhythm slows by a few more seconds, each cycle enough for the reaction window to begin thinning before anyone calls it a crisis. At the target designation node, tracking channels quickly fill to capacity. The decision is kept cold fire, sparingly conserve firepower for priority targets. The shift leader leans close to the screen, coordinating by eye-grouping targets by cluster. The system is not breached, but it has been forced to run at sustained high load just before the threshold where a small timing slip can trigger a chain reaction. The UAV swarm does not stop at dozens. It thickens to the exact number calculated in advance, roughly 120 modified civilian UAVs, grouped in clusters of 6 to 10 flying low under 200 meters at speeds of 120 to 150 kilometers per hour, stretched along the port of Temryuk and adjacent areas like a living layer of noise. They do not need to strike targets. They only need to persist long enough to pull the S-300 PM2 and S-400 Triumph into continuous operation where processing rhythm begins to erode. At the sensor layer, radar still detects them, but at the cost of time. Every non-priority target consumes tracking channels, confirmation cycles, and exchange bandwidth. Track files pour into 1 to 2 target designation nodes, like traffic forced across a single bridge. As the bottleneck heats up, everything behind it slows. Launchers wait for allocation instead of receiving clean tasking. Fire control crews must filter an extra layer. Responses to each decision arrive one cycle later. Early timing slips appear as scattered warnings. Then they become rhythm. Track files drop and reacquire in clusters as UAVs skim coastal terrain, and every lost track forces the system to rebuild the target, reconnect trajectory, revalidate, reassign priority. Small actions accumulate into visible delay 10 to 20 seconds per cycle in the highest load segments. In air defense, that is not slow. That is a lost window. Miss one update cycle, and the target slips past the geometry of its most reliable lock. At the firepower layer, the decision to fire sparingly begins to backfire. Launchers hold missiles for priority targets, but priority targets do not appear or not yet in a recognizable form. Meanwhile, low-grade targets remain on screen still consuming channels. Short-range layers such as Panzer S1 or Tor M2 handle part of the low-altitude load, but they too are channel-limited. Once the broader network saturates, the near layer is pushed into self-management, no longer receiving smooth queuing as under ideal conditions. Human operators are pulled deeper into manual loops. The shift leader no longer tracks individual blips, he calls by clusters and approach vectors. Fire control makes more hand selections. Priority conflicts surface directly in their orders: shoot the nearest targets to relieve pressure now or preserve channels for unknowns that might be the real strike. And the most dangerous element is the sense that everything is still fine. Green indicators remain lit. Radar continues emitting. The fused map still updates. No explosions occur near the coastal depot cluster under the duty station's responsibility. It looks like nothing more than a noisier than usual night, a tolerable level of interference. So posture remains unchanged. The trap does not reveal itself through an explosion. It reveals itself through a gap. In one corner of the corridor, a cluster flying terrain-hugging profile slips below radar coverage by geometry alone. Radar horizon, coastal terrain oscillation, and a track file briefly stripped of priority. Several traces vanish, then reappear seconds later at positions they should not have reached if the kill chain were still in rhythm. At that moment, the shift understands this is no longer a question of whether to fire. The kill chain has slipped, and once rhythm is lost, a single strike at the right bottleneck is enough to push the entire network into the next phase. 226. While the duty shift is still trying to patch the rhythm against the low-altitude swarm, a new group of tracks appears in a completely different manner, no longer fluctuating with terrain, no longer dropping and reacquiring in clusters. They hug the radar horizon, flying at altitudes of 20 to 40 meters, exactly along the geometric edge where surveillance stations can only detect them in the late phase of each scan cycle. In a network that has already lost rhythm, a delay of just one processing cycle is enough for the interception window to lose its geometry. There are only 6 high-speed strike vehicles approaching at velocities far exceeding the earlier low-altitude swarm and maintaining tight formation in the terminal phase. They do not target depots or command centers. They aim at 3 critical components of the air defense grid engagement radars: control cabins and power generation vehicles. These are unarmored targets, but the loss of each point means a launcher cluster behind it loses the ability to receive queuing for a decisive period of time. At the target designation node, the kill chain attempts to execute one more allocation cycle. Track files that have just been elevated in priority must be reassigned as targets shift into the terminal approach phase. Launch orders reach the launchers more than one standard operating beat late. Warnings still appear, but no longer in sync. At the short-range layer, Panzer S1 and Tor M2 are forced to operate autonomously within their own effective radii, no longer receiving stable queuing from the broader network. When targets arrive on the correct heading at the correct altitude in the correct phase, the near layer is left with only a very narrow reaction window. Impact does not occur as a concentrated artillery strike. It unfolds as a sequence of operational interruptions. Engagement radars cease emitting. Control cabins lose connectivity. Power vehicles are removed from the operational loop. On the fused map, 1 to 2 nodes drop out of synchronization, dragging an air defense corridor tens of kilometers long out of continuous surveillance. Tracks vanish simultaneously, not because the sky is empty, but because the system can no longer sustain a unified picture. The state of localized blindness is not measured in precise minutes. It lasts long enough to force the system to switch. Channels reconfigure and shift into a cautious mode, slowing the entire subsequent reaction cycle. Within that interval, a genuine operational window opens. That is when 4 main strikes pass through the corridor. No mass is required, only correct timing. They hit fuel depots and rear area command centers, producing effects not at the level of total physical destruction, but in the disruption of rear area rhythm for many hours afterward. In the duty room, warning indicators change state, but the map fails to reconstruct the tactical picture in time. When signals are gradually restored, they return into a different battle space. A coastal air defense gap persists for hours, forcing units to pull launchers back, reposition nodes, and accept reduced coverage. The conclusion becomes clear: the wall was not breached, it was blinded at the right moment. When the sun rises, what remains is not a successful explosion, but a new state of the port of Temryuk and its surrounding area. Reconnaissance imagery shows fuel depot burn points spreading in bands, suggesting a chain reaction rather than a single-point hit. The need to cool storage tanks, isolate the area, and sustain firefighting forces turns a point incident into a sequence of disruptions lasting many hours. Forward-line sensor nodes fall silent in a technical manner: loss of power, loss of control cabins, loss of synchronization launcher units. Behind them still exist but lack the eyes required to turn into timely firepower. The air defense gap along the Azov Sea coastline lasts 6 to 9 hours, not because systems are absent, but because the ability to sustain a stable kill chain collapses once the bottleneck is struck. The cost of a single night does not lie in what was destroyed, but in what was burned interception. And sustained alert costs exceed the price of the UAV swarm many times over. Expensive interceptors are expended against cheap targets, thinning interceptor reserves at the moment they are needed most. From that point on, confidence in load tolerance is no longer a reassuring slogan, but a question that must be answered through real change, dispersing nodes, altering duty schedules, and reinforcing short-range layers around sensitive points. This battle does not prove that long-range air defense is useless. It proves something colder, expensive systems are strong when operated by the book, and weak when forced to operate off-book for a long enough period. A radar wall does not collapse because it is punched through by explosive force, but because its rhythm is broken by load until a few high-speed targets need only touch the right bottleneck to darken the entire grid for minutes long enough for the main strike to pass through without requiring saturation. Not because the adversary is stronger, but because the system is forced to work in the wrong way outside its own original assumptions. The remaining question for every modern air defense doctrine does not lie in buying more radars or missiles, but in this: are they building networks to withstand real-world pressure, or only to function elegantly when no one is deliberately trying to break their rhythm?